Very good. This question, John, has to do with panels 1 to 4 of our exhibit, focusing on panels 2 and 3. We call the Bogota house, which is the modern one that is privately asked to be constructed between 1945 and 1965, which interprets the spatial values of the structure of the intermediate hall. Panel number 2 shows that this spatial structure was used indistinctly by the same study of architecture in houses of neocolonial style as well as modern style. Panel 3 shows us the recurrence of the structure of the intermediate hall and its interpretations. While in the US or in North America after war, there was a domesticity without the maid's room, and the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen were integrated. In these modern houses in Bogota, the adjacent parts to the halls were discriminated and assigned to service areas. John, what do you think about panels 2 and 3 and their graphical representation? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would just say very briefly, I'm fascinated by this hangover within the context of Bogota buildings. I mean, the great change in Western European living after the war is, of course, the decline in domestic service. And that is what revolutionizes and forces the modernist movement really to collapse houses into, with single interiors or massively reduced interiors, where with all these mod cons that allow you to live comfortably, the vacuum cleaner, the kettle, all these other things, you don't need domestic servants. But of course, what you're seeing clearly in Bogota is the continuance of domestic service, and therefore of building types that in other parts of the world are simply impossible to sustain.
Margarita, you have the floor. Yes, I would like to say that the denominated Modern House of Bogota was developed broadly during the 20 years that were mentioned, based on their location, the possibilities of the legislation, as well as their attitude. It had a result, a repertoire that had to do with spatial relations and connections with the exterior part, which we see the intermediate hall recurrently understood in a more abstract sense. It brought the collective imaginarium that said what it should represent, as well as the search for spatial and formal strategies that would fix the values of the new local architecture that, according to the authors, was modern. In panel 2, which is called Architects and Customers, we see some examples that were published in local magazines like Cloa and Casas Ilotes that at the end of the 40s, it was easy to see an English or neo-colonial house right next to a modern house designed and built by the same architectures. So very skillfully, you could please the customer in the more epithelial characteristics while they were exploring the spatial structures like the intermediate hall, which was known by its creators in occasions, even as based by the 30s experience. This changed because at the end of the 50s, the modern house of Bogota had much more acceptance within the elite, and that allowed the authors to have a more homogeneous and coherent style. This went from the client, the importance went from the client to the architecture, who not only designed the house according to their interests, but also had to do with the location where it was built, the furniture, the decoration, etc., promoting a new lifestyle according to the era. The houses in Bogota that are the wealthiest that take as a model the English houses also generated the social model that they want to copy. This means having a receiving room, a library, a room, family home with large rooms and with a definite individuality. There's a ritual that is reserved saying that each member of the spouses have their own room. And of course, they have to have the domestic service or maids that are also living in those houses. These houses that were mentioned have two reasons for the hall in the middle: to impress the visitors and also to have like the development of these areas. In a certain sense, they're away from the canonic English, where the hall, apart from distributing, also evoked for a long time that it represented the entire home or the household. In panel number 2, we observe that some of the modern houses are simply a stylized model of the Bogota English model. And the other group, the hall, makes a rich spatial articulation of the lower floor with the condensation of the rituals of domestic life, which says that there should not be a room for each occasion, or it becomes like the living room in some cases, or the family home where the members coexist. And receive their friends. Well, the architects back then, you have to have in mind, received a different type of education and knew the catalog style so they could interpret any type of partiture. So during these years, the modern architecture is in its mature period and it becomes like another style.
John, there are a couple of things I'd concentrate on here, but one of them is very specific to your own expertise as a highly experienced architectural editor. And that is that you will have noticed straight away that one of the big differences between the set of images that you're seeing of the mid-century Bogota houses and the previous ones we saw is the role of photography in representing those houses. And so the first point that I'd like to make here is whether you might like to comment on how the plan of houses, modernist houses, I suppose in the proper sense of the word, how it falls in love with photography and how photography is influencing it in return, and so that you create, in these cases, you can certainly create halls which might be small in plan, but which are going to appear intriguing to the average magazine reader. That's the first thing. The second thing is a more slightly narrower museographical point, which is that we're interested also in whether you feel that the images that are being projected at the moment, the ones that are connected to panel 3, to section 3 of the exhibition, whether they are the right way of presenting this argument. In other words, as somebody coming to the exhibition from outside, whether you might see a connection between the pink spaces in the historic houses, which we know much better, and these ones that you see now, whether it seems to you that there is a continuous story going on here. So those are, I think, points which for sure have clearly got a specific Bogota connection, but they're also generally true, I think, of the way in which the white houses of the 30s, 40s, 50s are developing. And of course, there is a situation in Colombia, as there is in some other countries that were outside the immediate orbit of the Second World War, which is that the 1920s, 30s designs go on developing fairly continuously without the interruption of the war in the middle.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating to see these modernist buildings. This emphasis I laid in the introduction on service and the way in which it transforms domestic life and modern appliances too, and modern materials. I say modern, but of course modernism now, as those photographs underline, is now really a style in its own right and well over a century old itself. That in fact all these things become part and parcel of a revolution in lifestyle. And what is so fascinating is that houses where that revolution in lifestyle hasn't taken place adopt the forms of that revolution, but they maintain the plans and the interiors of an earlier lifestyle. It's sort of a fascinating example of style driving forward changes which are not really following in the lived experience within those houses. I think the questions that Timothy raises are very fascinating. I mean, you're absolutely right, of course, that photography really since the turn of the 20th century has had a transformative effect on architecture. It is the art form that architects turn to relay their architectural ideas in the published form. I mean, it is also fascinating that the initial adoption of all these very English forms I mean, I presume it absolutely must be through the medium of publications and drawings that are coming to Bogota and that people are seeing. I imagine that almost nobody who's building a house in late 19th century Bogota has traveled widely in England. I may be completely wrong. I'm sure there are some people who have, but many of these house patrons presumably are dealing with their architects and working almost exclusively through what are already very widespread publications and plans. But photography, I think, does mark another major shift. And with photography, the technology to print high quality photographs, which of course in the 19th century, although photography is already widespread in the late 19th century, the ability to reproduce images in quantity from photographs is almost impossible. So hence the use of engravings and other typographic forms to publish material. Modernism has a very strange relationship with photography. I mean, it seems to me that making interiors look attractive, I notice even now, when I have dealings with new houses, architects very frequently want them photographed before they've been lived in, because the implication is that the owners will just spoil them and get in the way, and leave clutter all over the place. And of course, this is absolutely true, but it's a mark of whether a house works or not, as to whether it can sustain clutter and life. A merely perfect house in the modernist form is almost a Platonic ideal, I sometimes think. And of course, photography has the potential to capture that Platonic ideal. And I think it does influence the way modernism strives for light interiors, because of course you can't photograph dark interiors very beautifully. There are all kinds of qualities of interiors that you lose in photography, or at least which are much more difficult to capture. So I think photography has really reshaped the way we look at architecture, that we reflexively turn towards it. It has to be used, I think, with great caution as a medium, because it, I think, conceals space. I mean, the wide angle lens is an extraordinarily powerful tool, as we know from estate agents when they're trying to sell you a very small house, which looks enormous within the context of a sales brochure. So it is a very distorting thing. In response to Timothy's second question, to what extent are these interiors recognizable through time? It was actually something I was going to bring up in summary. I mean, as you will have gathered, I think that what you've done in this exhibition is formalize a problem. And I think formalizing it is really fascinating, and it illuminates all kinds of things. But maybe I will annoy people by saying that if I walked into some of the modernist interiors we've just been shown, and to look at them, and then to walk into Penshurst Place, would I think of them as the same interiors? Probably not. But having said that, it strikes me that the desire to create impressive entrances to houses, that desire to dignify thresholds, to make a house seem grand, and also internally to interconnect its elements, a hall is a natural solution. It becomes a formal space of greeting and welcome that serves practical function of interconnecting rooms within the house. And it is a space, of course, that you want to dignify. It's important that it looks impressive. And that concern to dignify the entrance to a house ultimately is what informs both Penshurst Place and some of the modernist buildings we've looked at. And I mean, I think as somebody, maybe Mark Gerard, I can't remember, pointed out, we do call in English the entrance to the house a hall for this very reason. So they are connected over time, even if they look different.